All right, hello everybody. Welcome back. This is going to be part two of chapter one. Of course, in part one, which hopefully you've already watched, and if you haven't, I would strongly encourage you to watch because it does line up with the first half of this PowerPoint. But this will be part two, and we're going to be talking about the linear model or linear process of mass communication. I'm also going to be introducing you to terms like convergence, and we're going to end it with something called culture as a skyscraper. So please make sure you watch this from top to bottom. And as always, some point in this lecture, I'm going to have a extra word that I'm going to throw out there that will give you extra credit on a quiz or exam. Okay, so basically, let's talk about here to start part two, the linear model or linear process of mass communication. And so, basically, when you're talking about basic communication, there's one of two forms. There's interpersonal communication and there's mass communication. And just I know that the book doesn't generally talk about interpersonal, but real briefly, interpersonal communication is where we're standing in each other's presence and it's face to face, right? That would be interpersonal communication. So all the things that you see here in front of you on the screen, some of these will definitely apply in interpersonal, and in most cases they don't because it's one-on-one conversation. Now, technically speaking, what I'm doing here is actually machine-assisted interpersonal communication, although the only really thing that you can do is if you don't want to continue to listen to me, you can simply hit stop and walk away. And therefore, the information is kind of stopped at that point. It's only one way. So, anyway, let's talk though mass communication. All right, which is there's actually a linear model and a cultural model. And linear model is pretty straightforward, which is basically these are the this is the process of producing and delivering messages to a large or mass audience. Okay. You have to have senders, you have to have messages, channels, receivers, gatekeepers, and feedback. Let me explain to you what each of these kind of how these relate in the linear model, if you will, of mass communication. Well, first of all, let's take senders, for example. And an example of a sender would be an ABC7. That's obviously where I work when I'm not teaching. That's a news organization. ABC7 is considered a sender. Netflix, believe it or not, considered a sender. I would say Sony Pictures, right, or Warner Brothers, Disney definitely would be considered a sender. A radio station would be considered a sender. It's basically all of the above. So it's authors, producers, organizations. Now the message is whatever that particular organization is sending out. So in other words, like let's just take ABC7, we do the news, right? So basically in that case, the message is the newscast. Or if you are Sony Pictures, the message is the films that Sony produces. If you are Netflix, it's the docu-series, the films, the TV series that ultimately you wind up streaming at home, right? Those are your messages. If you're a radio station, for example, it's going to be whatever music you play or whatever that happens to be, or that would be an example of a message. Channels are the actual newspapers, books, magazine, radio, TV, the internet. Channels are the specific things that a company that is a mass communicator ultimately then gets to the public, right? So basically, all the things that we're going to be talking about this semester are essentially channels, right? Well, we'll talk newspapers, but in general, films, books, magazines, radio, television, web, etc., all very much fall under channels. Then you have what's called a receiver, right? And earlier in part one, we talked about, someone that basically consumes media, what the definitions of those are. Well, in this case, the receiver is you, it's me. It's if you're reading a book, it's someone that's reading the book itself. If it's, basically, it could be someone listening to music on Spotify, right? That's a receiver. It's consumers. Okay, so it's readers, viewers, consumers, anything that is being mass produced. The obviously the message ultimately has to be received in that linear model. One term I definitely want you to get used to because it is critical in the linear model or linear process of mass communication is this idea called gatekeeper. All right. The gatekeeper is simply somebody that works at the organization, at the sender, if you will, the sender level, that basically determines what messaging is going to go through which channel, and ultimately you as a receiver are going to view. To put it simply, I'm at ABC7. When I work there, I'm in sports. I determine exactly what sports is going to be covered for that day or what you're going to see ultimately in my sportscast. And anything that I kind of leave out or even include is all part of that gatekeeping process. And there's a whole pecking order, if you will, in my newsroom of people that create content. And those content creators within those walls are called gatekeepers, right? You could also say the same thing for the film universe, from the people that select the screenplays to the people that greenlight, that actually have money that greenlight, projects or whatever. Those are gatekeepers. Those are who determine, how a film is either going to be produced or not produced, all the way down to the fact that when you're actually producing the film, you've got a director, you've got someone on set, obviously guiding actors and actresses. Those are all gatekeepers. So there's a pecking order in every single media industry. I would even say that if you look at, and we're talking about mass communication, we're talking about mass media. Now, if you're talking about, for example, someone that runs their own YouTube page or their own website, right, or their own social media channel, they also too function as a gatekeeper in a sense, because they're the ones determining what exactly is going to be, what content's going to be out there that you later are going to absorb. And then finally, we have what's called feedback, which is messages from receivers that are either sent back to senders or to gatekeepers, right? So easiest way to think about this is that basically, if you continue to watch a mass-produced show, like there's a show on television everyone loves, and the ratings are good, or the NFL gets a good number on like a football game, and continually wants to see more of that content, well, that's in a sense feedback, right? Feedback can also be negative in the sense that it can be you literally just changing the channel. Your feedback's almost instantaneous. It used to be in the past that feedback was a little bit more straightforward. In other words, if you watched a show, you read a book, you listened to some music, and you decided to write a letter or send an email, for example, to a company to say, hey, I love this, or this was really bad. That was also feedback, if you will. But so feedback is very ranging, but again, in the communication process, feedback, it's actually, believe it or not, easier to cut the feedback loop off in a mass communication setting, because if you simply don't like the thing you're watching, you just change the channel, right? If you don't like the music, you just hit skip, right? But if you're in an interpersonal sense, for example, we're having a conversation in the hallway and we're arguing over something or just talking, and I've got to go, but you need to still talk. I can still hear you as I walk away. That's going to be harder to disrupt that information flow. What about the cultural model for mass communication? Well, that recognizes that individuals bring diverse meanings to messages with factors that include and are different, that include gender, age, education, ethnicity, and occupation. So that's more of the modern model, meaning that anytime that we're absorbing some kind of content, right, any kind of mass media, we absorb it coming to the table with our own personal experience, or a certain age or a certain gender, right? How we feel about the world, how we see it. And we take those preconceived notions that we have of what we think are culture and life, and we basically absorb entertainment, information, etc., based on kind of whatever perspective we're coming from. And so by that token, audiences, that's you, actively affirm, interpret, refashion, reject messages and stories that flow through various media channels. In other words, we decide what we want to watch. We decide what we want to read. We decide what we want to listen to. We can lean into certain things that we like. So, for example, I love episodic television. I think the stuff that's being shown on Netflix these days and Amazon Prime and all these other streaming platforms, Paramount Plus, I continue to watch a lot of similar stuff. Like I'm a big Taylor Sheridan fan, right? So, and if you guys know who Taylor Sheridan is, he's the guy that, he does Landman, Yellowstone. I'm watching a show right now that I've been binging called Mayor of Kingstown, and I like that type of show, and so therefore, I seek that out when I'm wanting to absorb media. Versus my wife, for example, who thinks that I watch stuff that's like way too over the top, and she likes to watch other stuff like Korean dramas, for example, right? Which I'm not that interested in, but that's how it kind of works these days. Now, through selective exposure, people seek messages that respond to their own cultural beliefs. Now, I will say that it's very easy now because of how niche media is, whether it be on YouTube, on streaming media, on cable, whatever, for us to kind of seek out and stay in our own little kind of like cultural bubbles, if you will, to watch, read, absorb content, as opposed to being exposed to a more broader kind of. I mean, we have the opportunity to be exposed to it, but a lot of us don't choose to do that anymore because of what we have. There's a word called algorithm. You may have heard of that. We get to chapter 2. We're going to talk about how, because of AI, because of digital, because of the way algorithms work, we might just be continually fed something that we know, like I guess that the computer gods know exactly that we're going to be continually leaning into, and we're not going to get out of our lane, if you will. And that can be problematic, right? I just look at my industry, for example, the news industry, and how we, whatever, take the story. The fact is that you don't necessarily have to challenge yourself intellectually these days to kind of stay in your lane, and that's not good. There might be stories that are there might be networks, for example, that are politically opposed to what you believe in, right? So we've got, a common thing is, for example, people who are Democrat or who come from the left, right, liberal, if you will, are more apt to stay and watch MS Now, read the New York Times, watch CNN, are very suspicious of the news that comes out of Fox News and vice versa. If you're conservative, Republican, et cetera, you believe there's a strong media bias on the other side. And so here we are in these different lanes, and we don't leave them, and we don't have to leave them right now because we have content content that is constantly fed to us to keep affirming what our belief system is without challenging us. And that's not necessarily like healthy, if you will, just in my humble opinion. All right, so we are seeing an evolution in media now, and dropping the cultural versus the linear model is, putting that in the background for a minute. Let's talk about the evolution of media from a practical standpoint, from emergence to what's called convergence. And you could literally apply this to just about any kind of form of mass media that we talk about this semester, whether it be web, radio, television, film, etc., right? Is that there's common themes that happen for that form of mass communication to grow from basically like in a potted plant to like, a huge tree, for example, right? And the first one, of course, is the emergence or novelty stage, which is you have somebody, an inventor, a technician, trying to solve a problem, trying to actually create whatever that form of mass communication is. So when we get to, for example, we get to radio in particular and television, we're going to talk a lot about the people that early on were trying to figure out just how to like send messages visually, audio wise, not just down a wire, but eventually wirelessly, right? And that was the problem that those folks were trying to solve before it became what we call a mass medium, right? Well, then, as far as speaking of mass medium, how do you make money off of it? How does it become something that's a novelty to something that actually becomes something that you can make money off of, right? And so you find a practical and marketable use for the device, right? So when we're talking radio, for example, radio early on was just something that not just inventors kind of tweaked with, but it was sort of in a military sense a very big military tool. Well, eventually it became a consumer tool that what all of us could use, and there's a big process to go with it went into that, and we'll talk about that. You could say the same thing we're going to learn in chapter 2 about how the internet started versus where it is now. And I can just as a hint, I can tell you that the internet started as a as a way to stop the disruption of communication during, like, for example, a nuclear war. That's how it started. And of course, now think about what the internet does today. It involves everything, including what's called the Internet of Things. And then, of course, we're in the then you go to the mass medium stage, which is where business gets involved. Money is to be made, lots of money, right? And that is true with just about every single form of mass communication that I can think of. There's money that is always, there's, money to be made in producing whatever the content is, or running whatever the television station is, or publishing whatever the book is, or, bringing the film to the big screen so that you can make, people can make money. And then finally, we have the convergence stage. Convergence being a big word, which is really related, I think, to the internet and digital era, which is that now it's not just television, it's not just radio, it's not just music, it's not just film. All of those things, all these big forms of mass communication that lived kind of separately, as its own entity, are now converged into one space, right? And an example of that would be your phone, right? All these things that I mentioned can, have some kind of use on your phone. All right. So I want you to be familiar with 3 terms in media convergence that I think are critical to the, chapter 1. One is technological convergence, right? Which is the traditional media, like I said, TV, radio, newspapers, combining with digital platforms, websites, streaming, social media. So in other words, at one point, ABC7 was just a television station. Well, now you can watch news content, for example, not just on ABC7, but you can actually follow it on your YouTube channel or social media, right? It's created that way, and that's true with just about anything. You can watch films on YouTube now versus just on the big screen, 60 years ago. Okay. You also have what's called corporate convergence, which is large companies owning multiple types of media outlets. Example, a corporation owning film studios, news networks, and streaming services. I'll give you a big one, Disney. Disney, if you haven't heard of Disney, I can't help you, but along with obviously owning theme parks, Disney owns a streaming platform. Disney owns ESPN, which is the leading sports network on the Disney owns a series of movie studios, right? Disney owns, believe it or not, news stations. I work again for ABC7. Do you know who signs my checks? Disney. I have, like, every 2 weeks I get a check with a mouse on it, right? And so Disney is a perfect example of a big company. Another one would be Comcast, right? And then, of course, the one that you've probably heard of over the break, Paramount, Netflix and Paramount are kind of, Netflix is trying to kind of buy up the world, and as is Paramount / Skydance. All right. You also have content convergence, which is the same content being distributed the same content being distributed across different platforms. So I guess along with being technologically converging, the content converges as well. And then a news story appearing on a TV, a website, and social media, or, a movie trailer that you might see and, normally would have seen just on the big screen before a movie. Well, now you can click on YouTube. So content convergence is a big thing, not to mention like live sports, it's on apps, right? You can watch, sport, your live sporting event on an app now, along with watching it on television, along with watching it on websites. So those are your 3 forms of convergence. We are also in a cultural change as well, right? All of this convergence, all of this media, all this accessibility that we have that is literally at our fingertips and is instant, right? Has really changed the game, right? So old TV, you literally had to sit there and wait until something was on like at 8 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, now, of course, you can actually watch that same show on, on Hulu or Netflix or Amazon Prime. You can record it on what's called a DVR, right? So you can watch it on demand. We watch shows when we want to watch shows on our own. Again, I've been binging during the break as I'm preparing for, as I was preparing for this lecture. I will wholeheartedly admit I spend way too much time binging shows on Netflix or Paramount Plus. I find myself, instead of, like, for example, 20 years ago, if I was watching a series, it would take me, the better part of 5 months to watch it because I'd have to wait every week, to see a new episode. Well, now I can just like literally click next, next, next until I'm done with it. And the next thing I know, I've just barreled through like an entire series in a span of like 2 days. And we make media choices based on social media recommendations or YouTube, right? So an example of that would be that obviously there's a lot of modern shows that people talk about that wind up becoming a thing, right? Someone might share, a fun scene on YouTube, for example, and that might spur us to want to watch the entire series. Um, I still remember seeing scenes of Breaking Bad on Twitter and YouTube. That looked interesting. So I started watching the series long after it had started. And I probably would have never have done that if not for the fact that social media helped with that. We obviously upload our own media, including photos, homemade videos, which has led to the breakdown of the traditional family ritual. And what I mean by that is, think about it. Not only are people incessantly uploading their own media. I mean, all you got to do is just look at, for example, a big news story, and everyone's got their phones out to roll video on it, right? I mean, that's a power and a disruption all at the same time, because if someone's like is in a bad way, no one's helping that person because they're too busy rolling video. But in a more kind of closer to home way that I think that you might relate to is the idea that when we're at dinner, or sitting there or just walking down the hall, you'll notice people are just buried in their phones, right? What are they doing? Well, they're, they're doom scrolling through their TikTok or their Instagram, or they're constantly texting, or they're just lost in their Spotify and they've got their earbuds in. And this happens not just in the hallway, but also happens maybe when we're out to dinner, with family, and everyone's not paying attention to each other, not having conversations. And so, that has definitely shifted the culture. Multitasking while consuming media has led to a growing media consumption. Teenagers pack nearly 11 hours of content into 7.5 hours of actual time. So you ask yourself, like, when you're doing something, a task, you're sitting there watching television, you're hanging out with friends, how are you engaging? Are you incorporating media in kind of two separate ways? I know I do once in a while. I find myself when I'm watching, a show at home, or watching like maybe I'll watch an NFL game, and then I find myself also scrolling, and then I've forgotten. I'm not really keeping track of what I'm watching the game for. So it's kind of weird. Well, I definitely think that you have to realize that whether we're talking about music, we're talking about television, we're talking about streaming media, we're talking about film, books, etc., um, obviously news, I should say, we are into storytelling. We seek and tell stories, and we've been telling stories since the beginning of time. It's us, right? It's how we kind of like sort of relate to one another. It's how we better understand the world. And essentially, it has changed in the digital era because reality TV and social media dominate storytelling now, right? Now, that storytelling can be incomplete, out of context, rapid, um, you know, we basically take, for example, dare I say, as I record this, it's, obviously I'm recording this a couple weeks early before your semester started, but one of the things that I've been watching and everyone's been watching is two major stories. One is obviously what's happening in Iran right now. There are people that are actually trying to, I think, overthrow the government in Iran, and of course we have what's happening with what's happening in Minnesota, right? And I think everybody is already starting to sort of cement what their belief is based on the storytelling. And it's not just storytelling that you're seeing on traditional forms of media, but you're seeing it across social media. And everyone's trying to find the narrative, if you will, like, good versus evil kind of thing, right? I won't tell you how to think on that, but just ponder that for a minute and ask yourself, what storyline are you, following with these stories? And, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, right? That's kind of how we roll. So media institutions and outlets are in the narrative business, right? And now we can actually participate in that. In fact, we call this citizen journalism. We'll talk more about this when we get to journalism, but basically we have people that are out there that are participating in and having an effect on stories told in the media, right? And it's an interesting time to be alive for that. Media stories put events in context and shape how we understand our daily lives and larger world, right? I mentioned good versus evil. And of course, the famous quote, we tell ourselves stories in order to live, right? We, every day is a story. Every day we wake up, we try to figure out the world based on how we process things that happen, right? Things that we listen to, things that we watch. Okay. I want you to be familiar with three philosophers, Greek philosophers, if you will, and how that relates to storytelling. And it's really interesting because each of these philosophers, and again, these folks existed long before they had any idea that we were going to have stuff like Netflix or CNN or, up to the second updates on social media, but they already understood the power of storytelling. And so the first one was Euripides, and Euripides felt art should imitate life, meaning that whatever art, whatever visual that we would process, painting, in this case, it would just be simple paintings, but apply that to whatever shows we watch, news we watch, stories that we see on screen from maybe a good screenplay, that should imitate life, that there should not be, there shouldn't be a filter on it, that there shouldn't be always a happy ending or always it's just an accurate reflection, right? And because if everything is always rosy, if there's always the good guy always wins in the end, we'd love to see that, but that's not how life works, right? And so sometimes there are things that happen that we can't explain. People do things that we can't explain. Do you not reflect that when you're watching or reading a story? I don't know. You think about that. Plato said art should aim to instruct and uplift, but worried about some stage performances glorified evil and some might not be able to distinguish between art and reality. Easy way to think about that is modern media too violent? Is it too sexual? Is it too much? Right? And what is the age? Okay. So I always say that I use the example of Game of Thrones, right? Or just think of some kind of modern series that you watch now that's pretty over the top. I'll use what I'm watching now, Mayor of Kingstown on Paramount. It's pretty raw stuff, right? It's about organized crime and there's at least 4 or 5 people always getting shot in every episode, and it's very dark and violent. And would that be an appropriate show to put a 6-year-old in front of? I don't think so. Not a chance, right? Because I don't think kids need to necessarily have to be hit in the face with that kind of messaging, because I don't think they understand what they're watching. You hear the same thing about video games, for example. Should kids play violent video games? Is there an appropriate age? Should kids play over sexualized video games, or should they watch an over sexualized show? I don't know. I firmly believe, I think I think if we were all, sitting here having this conversation in person, that, I think hopefully a majority of you might have a threshold, right? And that's what Plato is saying, is a threshold. Then there's Aristotle. Arts and stories should provide insight into the human condition, but should entertain as well. At the end of the day, you can certainly have provocative stories, but at the same time, those stories should be entertaining, right? That maybe for every, I don't know, with your broccoli and carrots, you could also have a little bit of chocolate sundae too. That makes sense. So I don't know where you fall in terms of those Greek philosophers. Are you Euripides? Are you Plato? Are you Aristotle? Not saying anything is right or wrong, but I'd like you to think about that. All right. Now, the second extra credit word for the day, or the second extra credit word for the semester is surfing. Surfing. So if you write down surfing on a future quiz, you will get extra credit. All right, let's talk about contemporary culture, right? Cultural critics are concerned about the quality of contemporary culture. Is it too over the top, right? Is it too much? Is it over sexualized? Is it too violent? Is it anything goes kind of thing? What do you think? I think there's a lot of people that think that we as citizens, because we have access to so many different forms of entertainment now, of media, are we losing? Is it? I mean, dare I say, is it tearing our society kind of apart? I don't know. I don't know. I think that's something I want you to reflect on. I can tell you that there's an overwhelming amount of information now available, and that's good and bad at the same time. And the fact that, take social media, for example, it's hard to figure out what is actually true now, right? Because anybody can say anything on social media and share it, and if it's convincing, other people will pick up on it, and it doesn't necessarily make it true. Just because it's widespread and it's available doesn't necessarily make it true. So I would say that you have to reflect on the terms misinformation and disinformation. We'll talk more about that in chapter 2. But misinformation and disinformation are really a major part of contemporary culture when it comes to information. And how much that media shape society now in the future is still unknown. All right, a couple more slides to go here, and then we'll call it a day for part 2 of chapter 1. This is time spent per day with major media in the United States from 2019 to 2026. We spend over 12 and a half hours a day with major media. That's kind of the projection. I should say currently we're around 12 and a half, and that's probably where we're going to remain for now. But that's a lot of time. If you think about it, in a 24-hour day, half our day is spent in major media. And if you sleep 6 to 8 hours a day, then really 80 to 90% of your day where you're awake is consuming some kind of daily media. It's pretty daunting if you think about it. How about daily consumption of media by platform? Take a look at this graphic, and it's all age-based, right? So, for example, it's pretty straightforward that a smart connected television is consumed by just about the same amount of people, whether you're 18 to 34, if you're 55 plus. But television is actually something that is, like traditional television, is consumed at 55 and up in a far greater way than, say, for example, someone 18 to 34. And look at the smartphone. I think that's the one that really jumped out at me, is that the smartphone usage far greater for your age group, if you're in between 18 and 34, than my age group. Although I happen to use my phone way too much. So anyway, take a look at that. I think it's very interesting. The last thing I want to talk about is culture as a skyscraper. Top floors are, think of culture as a big tall building, right? And the top floors are associated with good taste or high culture. And that like would be, for example, the ballet, the symphony, art museums, right? So if you go see art at the LA County Art Museum, or you've gone to the Louvre, say in Paris, to look at some of those amazing things, or you've gone to the ballet to watch the Nutcracker, or maybe you've gone to listen to Beethoven's, gone to a symphony to listen to Beethoven, or gone to the Hollywood Bowl to listen to like, classic music. That's considered good taste or high culture. Lower floors are associated with popular culture or low culture. So I'm just the messenger here, so please don't shoot the messenger. But basically, pop culture is kind of considered lower floors. So, for example, soap operas, rock music, video games, considered low culture or at least lower on the thing. But the funny thing is that we as citizens, as media citizens, if you will, as media consumers, have a tendency to consume both, not just low culture, but we also consume high culture. I definitely fall into that category. So here's some things to look at. For example, Shakespeare's Hamlet. Is that high culture or low culture? Okay. Well, basically, this is designed where all the high culture is near the top. And as we get lower, that's where low culture is. And so, so if you're a Taylor Swift fan, sorry that she's in the lower rung, but I'm just, again, the messenger here. But I think you can kind of get a sense basically based on just this graphic here as to what's considered sort of considered high culture versus what's considered kind of lower popular culture. All right, well, that'll do it for chapter 1, part 2. Again, make sure that you review the PowerPoint. Also review the PowerPoint in part 1 if you have not seen or just skimmed through the first video, which was chapter 1, part 1. I would recommend you do that. And I will see you again for chapter 2.